Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Global Compliance Panel's live webinar on supplier evaluation and assessment, how to meet FDA QSR and ISO 13485 requirements in a cost-effective manner. My name is Michael, and I'll be your host for today's session. On behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for being part of today's event. The webinar for today will be presented by Mr. Jeff Kassoff. Mr. Kassoff, RAC, is the Director of Quality at Medivators, a leading manufacturer of endoscopy products. Among a lot of things, Jeff is a primary liaison for all regulatory agency inspections. In his 20-plus-year career in quality and regulatory affairs, he has been FDA liaison for dozens of audits, prepared responses to 483S and warning letters, and participated in face-to-face meetings with FDA officials. Jeff received his regulatory affairs certification in 1996. So we are honored to have Mr. Jeff Kassoff with us to present today's webinar. Before we begin, ladies and gentlemen, just want to quickly tell you about today's program. This webinar is for a 60-minute duration. First, Jeff will take you through today's session, highlighting the areas that he's going to cover, and then he will share with you his presentation. And would like to inform all our participants that once part of the teleconference, you've been placed on mute and will remain so until the Q&A window begins, which is towards the end of the webinar. This is again just to ensure that there is no discontinuity while the speaker presents the webinar, and at the same time, all of you could take maximum benefit from the session. And you have enough time at the end of the session for the Q&A. You have about 10 minutes of time at the end of the presentation. And for any reason, if you do get logged out of the session, please follow the same procedure to join in again. Now that we're all ready, I do request Jeff to take it from here. Jeff?
Thanks very much for the introduction. Let me welcome everybody to this webinar. Let me first apologize. I seem to have come down with a bit of the bronchitis recently, so there may be a bit of coughing and clearing my throat throughout the presentation, so just to appreciate your patience in this area. Today's webinar is going to cover supplier evaluation and supplier assessment. As difficult as it is to manage your own internal processes of a company of which you are a contributing member, it's that much more difficult to manage the practices of another company, a company that is so important that it provides you with, in some cases, very critical components or services that you are merely one of their customers. It's difficult to manage suppliers, especially when you have either a single source supplier or a supplier who provides you with a component at a price that is so much more cost effective than any others. So bear in mind throughout this presentation that part of the importance of supplier management is working with your suppliers to not so much baby them as it is to treat them like equals and let them know that you hold them to the same standards that you hold yourselves to. I'm going to begin the presentation with covering regulatory requirements. After that, we'll cover the elements of a supplier qualification program, because you're going to begin with qualifying your supplier, and potential suppliers. Then after you have the supplier, you will assess the supplier. In between the two, we're going to cover quality agreements. Excuse me. Then we'll also cover supplier nonconformances, which is what to do, how you handle it when a supplier does not comply with an agreed position. Then documentation. I like to include Section 6 because what I find is that it provides a good summary of all the areas. As I said, we'll begin with regulatory requirements. Briefly, domestically, there hasn't always been a requirement for supplier qualification management. The early revision of the Good Manufacturing Practices did not really have an official requirement, but during an FDA inspection, when it came to looking at your nonconformances and how you handle them, the auditor, the inspector, would look at how you went ahead and qualified, how you managed your suppliers. Since the current version of the QSR is implemented in '83, they added 820.50a, which now sets forth specific requirements, and we'll cover them, with regard to how you evaluate your suppliers, contractors, and consultants. Something I want you to pay attention to during the presentation is the distinction between suppliers, contractors, and consultants. Internationally, they've always been a little bit ahead of us. Even the 1996 version of ISO 1345 addressed assessment of subcontractors, and when the standard was revised in the 2003 version, all it did was add explicit reference to to outsourced processes. There's a standard, a guidance document that I've referenced here that is available on the internet. I'm not going to cover it too much other than to say that when it comes to defining whether you consider a process that is performed for you to officially be an outsourced process, go ahead and look at the standard. A good example is if you purchase a blank, an empty printed circuit board, that's obviously a component, but it begins to become a gray area when you have a firm that sells you either partially or fully loaded printed circuit boards. So that's a good example of something to pay close attention to. When it comes to the domestic requirements, the purchasing controls in 82050 talk about all product and all services. It doesn't distinguish between types of product and types of services, other than to implicitly say that it's product or services that go on or in or with the device, or are used that to assemble or test or inspect the device. An example of something that does not fall under purchasing controls would be your office supply company. 82050A talks about how to evaluate all of these people, and the section, and I'm not going to regurgitate the entire section, I do like to point out a particular section that requires you to establish and maintain the requirements, including quality requirements that must be met by suppliers, contractors, and consultants. It's very interesting that the drafters of the regs chose to put the phrase including quality requirements, because what that all but states is that there are requirements other than quality requirements, other than those that deal solely with component acceptance. That's what quality requirements are. And that's what you need to read into when you begin to determine the requirements for and how to go about qualifying and assessing your suppliers. The requirements, the regulations state that you've got to evaluate and select your potential suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. Now, looking at those two words, those are two separate requirements. Obviously, you're going to select your suppliers based on a particular set of characteristics, but you've got to evaluate those suppliers also. Those two things must both be proven. Obviously, the classic thing in FDA is if it's not documented, it's not done. So when you select suppliers, you're obviously going to have supplier files that show how you selected your suppliers. But look at another word in this regulation, the word potential. You can certainly show that you have selected potential suppliers because they have become suppliers. But how do you go about evaluating potential suppliers? What that says, and I've been involved in quite a few FDA inspections where this has happened, is to show the agency and to actually show yourself also that you evaluate potential suppliers. You're going to have evaluated suppliers whom you ended up not using for whatever reason. So you're going to have records of suppliers that you never used, that you never purchased any product or service from. So make sure that when that happens, you maintain those documents as evidence that you complied with these regulations. Something interesting also in this is that you're going to evaluate and select these potential suppliers on the basis of their ability to meet specified requirements. Here we go again, including quality requirements. So there are things other than meeting the quality requirements of the product that is delivered. And you've, of course, as it says here, you've got to, it says the evaluation shall be documented. Notice how it doesn't say the selection shall be documented, but the evaluation shall be documented, which further supports my statement a minute ago that you've got to evaluate potential suppliers and show that you have evaluated these suppliers that you never used. You've got to define both the type and extent of control. And this type of control and the extent of the control has to be based on the evaluation results. Now, it's okay to standardize throughout your entire system, your entire supply management system, that if you get acceptable evaluation results, this is how you, what type of control you exercise over the product, and what type and to what extent you do it. Do you perform incoming inspection over the product? Do you merely do some sort of verification of the product? So this is a part here where, as you can see in the regulation, the control, the type and extent of control you're going to exercise is over the product, services, and suppliers. So your type and extent of control over the product is usually an incoming inspection or an incoming test or an incoming verification. But the type and extent of control that you're going to exercise over the actual supplier of that component is obviously related, but a different type of control. Over what period of time do you annually assess these suppliers? By what method do you assess these suppliers? I'll talk about this again, but a system that I've used for many years is when I assess a supplier and they have an ISO certification, an appropriate ISO certification. If I'm using a manufacturer, I'd like to see ISO 13485 or 9001. If I'm using a calibration lab, I'd like to see ISO 17025. If I'm using a sterilizer, I'd like to see ISO 11135. When I use a calibrator and they don't have ISO 17025, which is the calibration international standard for those of you who aren't familiar with it, but they have an ISO 9001, the type and extent of control I have over that calibration lab may be a little different than the same type and extent I have over a calibration lab that is 17025 certified. So what we do here is, if we have an appropriate ISO certification, the type and extent of control we exercise over the suppliers is we assess them twice a year. We give them a numeric grade. We'll talk about that a little more as we go forward. And if they pass, if they meet the requirements, I mean, it's a 90% requirement. It's not your standard 65 or 70 high school or college passing, of course. Then that is the appropriate type and extent of control. And twice a year, if they meet their grades, so to speak, then they're good. So that's sort of a way to draw conclusions and a way to apply this requirement in practice. You've also got to establish and maintain records of acceptable suppliers, contractors, and consultants. So you've got to establish the records. What are the requirements? And you have to maintain records according to the requirements that you have established. So it only says here, interestingly enough, that you have to establish and maintain records of acceptable suppliers. Now, don't read too much into this. Don't say, well, it says acceptable. So if I determine that a supplier is unacceptable, I don't need to maintain records of them. That's not necessarily true. Once you qualify a supplier and you use them for the first time, they are acceptable to you, even if they fail their grades, so to speak, and they fall off the list. At one point, they were acceptable. So until you remove them from your approved vendor list, they are considered an acceptable supplier. And remember that there are three things we're looking at here. We're not just looking at suppliers who sell you product. We're looking at contractors or subcontractors, same thing, people who perform processes for you, whether it's the printed circuit board example I gave earlier, maybe it's some software development or something to that effect. And then consultants also do fall under this regulation. We'll talk about that just in a minute. just want to spend a second talking about the ISO standards. What you'll see here is it's very interesting is that there's a bit of risk and product realization here. The ISO standards tell you that the extent of control that you apply to the suppliers is based on the effect of the product you purchase from them and how that product can affect your product realization process, which is from your development to your implementation, and the operation of the final product. So it's really, at the risk of reading the slide here, it's very risk-based here. So you're going to establish your criteria for supplier control based on what they give you and how it can affect your processes and your product, which suggests that a little difference here between this and the domestic standard, where here it's difficult, where here, since it's product specific, you're going to have a same type and extent of control over a supplier of the same product, independent of whether that supplier is or is not ISO certified. The differences here is that the domestic quality system reg requires us to establish and maintain records of acceptable suppliers. I've seen this done two ways, and I do want to talk about both of them. One is significantly less popular than the other one, and in my opinion, for good reason. But I just want to throw this out there as an option, especially perhaps for smaller companies. Usually, you have the approved supplier list. It's a large document, depending on the size of your company. If you're between maybe a 50 and a $100 million company, you're going to have an approved supplier list, and it's going to be quite extensive. Smaller companies, though, may avail themselves of the option of, in each of their component specifications or each of their service specifications, for example, if they have maybe some OEM manufacturing done for them, they're going to list the approved suppliers in those documents. These firms will not have an approved vendor list. And the downside of this, and I may mention this later, but I want to make sure to mention it now, is that the approved supplier list itself is not necessarily required to be a change-controlled document via your document control process. However, if you list your approved suppliers if you embed them in your component or service specifications, then they are by nature document controlled. So if I have an approved supplier list and I add a supplier, I move a supplier, for example, obviously I would need to maintain that and date track that. But if I have a component specification of a particular capacitor and I eliminate a supplier from that, I'm going to have to change control that document. Again, for a smaller company, that might be a little bit reasonable, maybe a single product, smaller company, handful of specifications, that's the only product or type of product that they're dealing with. The second option here may be a little more straightforward for a company like that. Another difference is that the quality system reg actually requires us to do something that is, not coming to mind at least, not a requirement in any other regulation. It requires us to try to do something. Usually when requirements are imposed upon us in the regs, it's we shall do this, we shall document this, we shall perform this. But in the quality system reg, we're required to try to get an agreement from all of our suppliers that they're going to notify us of any changes to the product they supply us or to their processes involved in the manufacture of that product before the changes are implemented. My experience tells me that I'm lucky to be told with a shipment of a particular product, maybe a piece of paper, some sort of product change notice goes in there. It says, these components look different than the others because we changed them, and hope that doesn't have any adverse effect on your product, but good luck with that. Especially when you're a smaller company, that's the kind of treatment you get. If you're a larger company, maybe carry a little more weight, or if your supplier themselves are a smaller company and you're one of their primary customers, perhaps you might be more likely to receive notification in advance. Even when it comes to critical components, for example, Tyvek pouches, I've been in situations where I was at about a $20-some-odd million company, and we received notification from our pouch manufacturer that with the next shipment coming in 3 months, the pouches were going to, the film was going to be a different width, and the Tyvek was going to be a little thicker also. So obviously what that means to us is that we would have to have performed either a sterilization revalidation or some sort of localized product sterility test, and then also package integrity test. So in that case, they did tell us in advance, but it was going to cost us tens of thousands of dollars. So again, this is a requirement to try to get an agreement, but not necessarily to get an agreement, because the onus in this regulation, this requirement, is not upon you, it's upon your suppliers. ISO, as I said, very risk-based. The control that you exert over the materials and the suppliers is related to the actual effect of the product you get or the service you get from those suppliers. What I want to cover now is the elements of the supplier qualification program. So we'll begin with the key terms, and then identifying the types of suppliers, determining the need for qualification, then the steps of the process, the qualification process, and supplier selection. And I'll mention this here. This will not be the last time I mention it. One of the key elements, obviously besides compliance and identifying a good supplier, one of the key elements of a supplier management program is cost efficiency. There are certain things that many medical device and pharmaceutical companies do, many industry companies do, that are not required. We'll talk about them throughout the presentation. Many firms use some very key terms in their own procedures that are not documented in the regulations. You've got to make sure that when you use these words or phrases, that you document them, that you define them, in your procedures. Classic is approved or unapproved. What does it mean that a vendor is an approved vendor? Do they appear on your approved vendor list? Are they documented maybe in each of the specifications, as we mentioned earlier? I've heard and seen the term preferred also used. There are components that you may purchase that may have multiple sources, but one of those sources either gives you a better delivery time or is a little less expensive. So that's a preferred supplier. And again, it's an implied concept, but define it in your procedures if you use that word. Other words I've seen tossed around that I'm not a big fan of: a qualified supplier. I guess that means an approved supplier. I've even heard certified suppliers used, and I have no idea what that means. In my mind, something that's certified is something that has a certification. I'm not in the business of providing certifications to my suppliers for them to use to get other business. So that's the only thing I can think about when it comes to the concept of a certified supplier. In identifying the types of suppliers, the question you're going to ask yourself is, what are the things that you get from a supplier? Well, these types of things begin with a distinction here. One is a component, and this is something that is going to be included in your finished device, a plastic part or something to that effect, software, a label. That's meant to be in your device. But a manufacturing material is something that's used in the process, or it's something that's produced during the process. It's on your finished device, but not by your design. If you make printed circuit boards, solder paste is something that you need if you manually assemble process. Then you will put paste down and assemble and put the components onto the board. That most of the solder paste evaporates, as does, if you make consumables, something like cyclohexanone, which is a bonding agent that's used to, for a very short moment, enable you to assemble two components together, and it has a brief chemical effect on one of the plastics to make it a little more malleable for the moment, to enable you to assemble it together. And at the end of that, the cyclohexanone, unlike glue, the cyclohexanone all but evaporates away completely. There are still trace amounts on your device, which is what makes cyclohexanone a good example of a manufacturing material. Other types of things you get from a supplier, specifically a service provider or a contractor, those are the same words in the two different standards. The terms are not defined when it comes to things you get from a service provider or contractor. Obvious examples are calibration and sterilization. Obviously, these are suppliers that need to be qualified and assessed. A little less obvious that people often think of are outsourced functions like design or assembly. Again, assembly, a good example might be printed circuit board assembly. Even less obvious, and I promise that the reason this appears on the slide is because at a previous company, I was at a notified body audit. They audit you for your ISO 9001 compliance, for those of you who are not familiar with that. And during my supplier assessment and supplier management part of the audit, the auditor asked me to see my supplier assessment of my document storage, my off-site document storage facility. So that's why this is here, because I've been cited for it. Not during other notified body audits, but I figure what I like to bring to the table during my webinars is experience. So if you choose not to qualify and assess your document storage provider, realize that somebody with experience is explaining to you that there's a chance you could be cited as a noncompliance for that during your ISO audit, not so much during your FDA inspection. Well, and another question is, does it go too far when you're talking about consultants? Oh, excuse me for a moment. And the answer to that is not necessarily, but you do it anyway. Every time you hire a consultant, you're going to have looked at their resume, their CV, and you're going to make a decision based on that. By doing that, you are, in essence, qualifying that supplier based on documentation. People aren't ISO certified. They can't complete supplier qualification surveys. But you are qualifying that supplier, that consultant. In determining the need for the type of qualification, more specifically the need for the type of qualification, I like to divide the types of qualification into two, paper and personal. And you want to base that on two areas, how you handle your qualification. How significant is the item or service provided? Is it something critical, like sterilization, like OEM, like outside manufacturing? Those are very critical, very highly significant items and services. Perhaps you buy an off-the-shelf tubing. Well, that's a little less significant. And secondly, what's the impact of the item or the service upon the product? You can do sort of a mini risk assessment here. What's going to happen to the product, or the patient, of course, if the item or service that you're looking at qualifying fails? And what's the likelihood of that failure? You may not have a lot of intelligence into the second one of these if you've never purchased something similar before. But if you're expanding a product line or replacing a particular component in an existing product or product line, you do have this visibility, and you're able to talk about how likely it is that that product fails. When you look at both of these characteristics, that's going to enable you to determine whether you do a paper qualification or a personal qualification. And we'll talk about the distinctions between each of those in a moment. Suffice it to say that a paper qualification is a questionnaire survey, and a personal qualification is actually an on-site visit. The first thing you do in your qualification process is you're going to identify the potential supplier. Don't make the mistake, though. Don't let your R&D guys look at a particular design application and say, yes, this potential supplier does offer this component that will work for our needs. Go ahead and start qualifying them now. There's also a very important implication that you need to take into effect, and I can speak for personal experience that many companies I've been at often overlook this. And it comes back to bite you when it comes to things not so much like cost, because many technical engineers remember to find out how much things cost, and that's pretty straightforward. But they haven't done any cost comparison to other potential suppliers. Neither have they spoken to the supplier that they're speaking with to get these components and asked them what their delivery times are. So you need to involve in identifying potential supplier, both R&D or engineering, whatever you choose, and also purchasing or materials. If you're going to purchase a specialty product, which is not an off-the-shelf component, you're going to have them fill out a supplier qualification survey. And there are two questions. It reads first question and second question here, but they're really simultaneous. One is, are you registered with the FDA or Health Canada? And the second is, are you ISO certified? I've written 9001/1345, but it's also okay for 17025 or 11135. Again, as I spoke earlier, depending on their specialty. If they say they're FDA or Health Canada registered, go to the website. If they say they're ISO certified, request a copy of that. The statement that the certified body must be reputable was more applicable to about 5 to 8 years ago, when the ISO certification process was becoming much more widespread and a lot of fly-by-night companies opened. So these days, everything seems to have settled so that even if you've never heard of a particular certified or notified body, I can tell you that they're going to have a website, for example. They're going to have many other customers. When you get the copy of the certification, and again, this is another example of something that a company I've been at has been cited for during a notified body audit. It's not enough to just get the certification upon the certificate, upon qualification. You've got to make sure that each time it's about to expire, that you remind yourself to request a new copy upon renewal. And the way we handle it is that if I have a company that is both FDA registered, or Health Canada, and ISO certified, or even in many cases, just ISO certified, we consider this supplier contractor approved. The reason for this is because, speaking to ISO specifically, I want to qualify this new supplier. And what I'm going to do, if I have to, of course, if they meet the criteria of critical to the operation of my product and high risk, is I'm going to go to their facility. How long am I really going to spend there? A day. That's a lot. Once in a while, I've heard of people spending 2 days during a supplier qualification assessment, but there are times where the supplier qualification ends up in no relationship between the two. That's not fair to anybody. It ends up being a waste of time. So usually it's 1 day. In many cases, it might not be the whole day because you fly in the night before, you get there first thing in the morning, but you got a 4 o'clock flight, so you really got to leave at 2:30. So compare the assessment I can do in that period of time versus the fact that this potential supplier has been ISO certified for 7 years. So over that time, they've had at least 7 week-long inspections. Which are you going to go with? And the answer is the ISO body. So that's why it's reasonable and has proven to be in compliance to use that particular process. However, if the supplier or contractor is not ISO certified, they've got to complete the remainder of the supplier qualification survey. And the qualification survey is very in-depth because my goal is to be cost efficient when it comes to qualifying my suppliers. So the bottom line is that if I can either have someone else have done my work for me, such as a notified body granting an ISO certification, or I can have the supplier do my work for me, such as filling out this pretty in-depth supplier qualification survey, then I can be cost efficient in qualifying the supplier, doing it in a timely manner and a costly manner. The first question on the supplier qualification survey, you want them to provide you any organizational specifics. An org chart's fine. Just take a look at that. Any site information. How big are they? Do they have any sort of specialty environments that you might need? You want to look at their quality program. Do they have a quality manual? What kind of training do they do? Do they have inspection procedures? Do they have an incoming inspection on components that go into the finished product that they're going to give you? What kind of calibration or maintenance program do they have? And do they do any sort of internal audits? Now, in the supplier qualification survey, it is not required that potential suppliers answer yes to everything. It's all about what your conclusion is going to be. Our conclusions are drawn by our purchasing department, materials that is, and our quality department. And they determine whether, for example, looking at these few questions under QA program, under quality program, let's say that I have a potential supplier who doesn't have a quality manual and they don't do internal audits, but they do the rest of these things. Kind of a gray area. How important is the quality manual or internal audits to the processes or product that they provide to me? That's up to me. I can't answer that question during this webinar, but that's going to be up to you during your assessment of these potential suppliers. My opinion is if they train people how to do things, they have inspection procedures that show them how to inspect or test things. They perform incoming inspection on things that are going to go into my device, and the equipment they use to quantify is calibrated and maintained, that's going to be good enough for me. So, some of these things, as I said, are more business required than process required. If there's no inspection plan, maybe their delivery dates might end up being off, for example. Do they have, what type of segregation do they have when it comes to returns? Do they handle complaints? If not, that's okay. But you've got to make sure that that they have an area that will enable them to process their returns. What type of procurement control do they have? How do they specify product that they purchase, and how do they verify product that they purchase also? Do they do any production qualification process? How do they know that the processes they're going to use to give you your product actually produce product that meets your requirements? Do they perform in-process inspection? Out of all these, this is one of my favorites to look at. It's not just because I'm in quality, but this is not required at all. But it's a great business requirement. If my supplier tells me 4-week lead time, but they have no in-process inspection, they're not going to know till the very end, till 3.5 weeks, that the assemblies that they made for me failed. So now I'm 3.5 weeks in the lurch, as opposed to being, perhaps they have a 1-week in-process inspection, as opposed to being 1 week behind at that point. You also want to ask them, to what extent do they have any sort of handling or labeling or shipping or records? How do they handle that kind of stuff? If you need to contact them back and say, this particular serial number was bad, how did you make it? Do they have the records that will be able to show you that? What type of design or document control do they have in place? Is it maybe just a physical kind of thing, or do they have a procedure, for it? The supplier qualification survey itself is probably at 7 or 8 pages at least. I've summarized it here during this 1-hour webinar, but these are the things you want to look for. And then at the end of this, at the end of the questionnaire, it's going to be reviewed by your company. You have 3 choices: acceptable, the supplier is acceptable, in which case you go ahead and use them. You can decide that your supplier is conditionally acceptable. If you don't like a lot of the answers you've received in your questionnaire, but the product is maybe an off-the-shelf product, that's okay. You can determine that they are conditionally acceptable or unacceptable. This supplier just can't do it, and we're not going to use them. However, again, as I mentioned much earlier, make sure that you maintain, that you keep qualifications of suppliers that ended up being unacceptable. If, continuing as I mentioned a moment ago, the off-the-shelf product, there are going to be times where purchasing identifies a website that they're going to purchase off-the-shelf product from. You can just automatically have this supplier, it's an off-the-shelf product. Remember, it's not a custom design product. You can have these suppliers be conditionally approved. You want to make sure that quality and purchasing document this. And you want to limit that for a 6-month period. And the way I've handled it in the past is if supplier has shipped you at least 1 shipment and you haven't had any non-conforming product, they can provide you quality product, and you move them up from conditional approval to full approval. And we have sort of qualification mechanisms that we use. So in the supplier file, it just doesn't have conditional crossed out and approved checked. There's some wording next to it, and we document that as proof of shipment. And the answer is yes, one shipment over a 6-month period is enough. It's an off-the-shelf product. In truthfulness, in actuality, the only thing that can go wrong with an off-the-shelf product is you get the wrong one. And again, as I mentioned earlier, to qualify consultants, consultants have to have what the regs call proven expertise in a particular area. That's the resume. You're doing that anyway. So I'm often asked the question, well, I have a potential supplier. Their price is good. Their claim delivery is great. Their reputation is really good too. Can I use them if they don't want to complete the supplier qualification service? They say, no, no thanks. Well, yes. Obviously, I would limit this to products that aren't high risk or critical to the operation. And we use a conditionally approved status, as we used a 6-month one earlier. We use a 12-month one now. We document it by quality and purchasing. And at the end of the 12-month period, we review the status. If their history, meaning delivery, and performance of the product are acceptable, we can update their rating to approved. And that's proof of shipment mechanism also. When it comes to supplier selection, just make sure you have a list, that on your list you have the date and method of selection, certification, survey, or grandfathered. The concept of the grandfathered supplier is kind of an archaic one. And in all honesty, it'll probably be removed from subsequent presentations of this webinar. But back in the day, when regulations, when this whole concept was first being implemented, the agency left industry and out, which was to say, if you used a supplier prior to implementation of the regs, implementation of the procedures interpreting the regs, and you can show that that supplier has provided you with the same component at the same rev level, and it's undergone no changes, then you can prove that, then you can continue to use that supplier. It's been such a long time now that the grandfathered status has been in place that, in all honesty, you don't have a component now that you receive from a particular supplier that you've been receiving since the mid-'80s. So, just pay attention to the fact that this is more sort of an historical occurrence than it is one that's currently in use today. However, you obviously do need to maintain the list of approved suppliers. What I want to talk about now for a couple of minutes is quality agreements. And it's an agreement in contract form, but it's not a contract. It is signed by both parties, but it's more of an agreement. I like to reserve this for more critical products or services. And really, it's just a document that both sets forth both of our requirements, mine and the other party, and it clarifies the expectations. I'll give you some examples of what's in the quality agreement right here. You want to state the intent, and I've included some sections here for you to pretty much just grab, take, and put in your quality agreements that you're going to use. Obviously, you want to state the intent that it deals with product which shipped from them to us. You want to make sure that you have a statement of authority which states that whoever's signing this for both parties has the authority to make commitments, that it's not just a technician or somebody who can't bind the company. And you want to set forth the training requirements. Are there particular tasks that you want the supplier's personnel to be trained upon? If they're making printed circuit boards for you, do you want them trained on the ASTM spec or maybe the IEC standard, assembly standard? If not, this section can be blank. And if you have training requirements, you don't want them to send you those training records. That is a bad way to have a relationship, that you need them to prove it to you. You just want to state in the quality agreement that if you request the documentation, they will provide it to you. Or even, you want to maybe perhaps even limiting your request to upon request in response to a regulatory agency request, something to that effect. You want your supplier to report serious negative changes the regulatory status to you as soon as possible. If they receive a warning letter, for example, if they're a medical device company, if their product is seized or something like that, you want to require them to tell you immediately. If it's a company that has an ISO certification, if they change or modify their certificates, you want them to tell you and send you new certificates. If design is an issue with your potential supplier, you may want to consider requiring them to be in compliance with any applicable design or validation standards. If it's your contract sterilizer, obviously they need to be in compliance with ISO 11135. Who ships what to whom? Do you get a certification with each shipment? If you do, what is on it? Never ever specify we get a certification with each shipment. I've seen certifications that are so worthless to be ridiculous. You want to make sure that any certification you receive is very specified when it comes to scope. What model, what lot or serial numbers, and how many. And when it comes to shipment method and carrier, who specifies it and how do they specify it, verbally, email, etc. When it comes to field reports, you want your supplier to know a couple of things. That you do receive complaints from the field, and you do perform investigations on that product. And you want to let them know that if your investigation at least suggests, if not concludes, that their product is an issue, you want to make sure they understand that you're going to be issuing them some documentation for their completion, which requires them to do a root cause analysis of the component that was at issue. You'd be surprised how many suppliers are unaware of that's what we do. When it comes to documentation, you want to specify here what documents are going to be supplied or available or documented at their location. Sterilization implications have to be specified in this area. Any DHR or any sort of record of how they assembled the products they make for you should be available upon request or available upon request by a regulatory agency. How long do you need them to keep their documents? Well, the answer is at least 3 years or the life of the product, depending on whichever is longer, because that's in the regulations. Who specifies the labeling content? Usually it's going to be you, but maybe it's your supplier. What traceability requirements do you have on them? Do you want them to trace every single thing and every single job they make for you by lot or serial number? If you do, they won't be your customer. You're not going to be their customer very long, I can tell you that. And here's the requirement that the QSR puts upon us, but you want to put upon your supplier, that any significant change, not any change. I can tell you as somebody who has supplied OEM product, I've received requests for any change has to be communicated, and we make changes, in cleaning materials, or we changed supplier of a particular component. Just significant changes or significant problems experienced in the product has to be reported to you, not just to your company, but to whom and how. Email or writing is good. So now that we have qualified our suppliers, we're going to assess them. And we're going to assess our suppliers on a periodic basis, and we're going to define what that frequency is and how we do it in our SOP and our procedure. And you can differ that between suppliers, contractors, and consultants. You can differ that between suppliers of the same product, depending on how their qualification went. But make sure that you consider what you get from the supplier before you determine how you're going to monitor their performance. You don't have to go to a supplier to monitor their performance. You can look at historical data. You can look at merely acceptance data, and you can make your conclusion that way. There's a pro and a con with regard to the non-visitation assessment. Well, obviously, if you don't go, if you're able to do this in documentation, it costs less and it takes less time. But, however, if you choose to go to the supplier, it becomes a supplier audit. Supplier audits are not subject to FDA review. So in that case, you would merely prepare a certification that says, on this date, on 12/20 of 12, I, Jeff Kassoff, went to the supplier, and here's what I looked at these few things, and and that's what I did, and you would sign that, and that would be verification to FDA to show that you performed this supplier audit. The assessment process is the first thing you're going to set forth is how you evaluate it. Well, there are a couple of variables you want to put in here. Obviously, in my opinion, as a quality person, of course, the quality of the product is the most important thing. So I'm going to look at acceptance rate by piece and acceptance rate by shipment, each shipment also. However, I'm also going to look at on-time delivery, condition of the product, and how many changes they have to the product, and whether they are announced or unannounced. I'm going to determine our procedure a minimum acceptable level. I've seen 80% the most. We use 90% here. But you're going to state what that requirement is, and in your procedure, you're also going to describe what action is going to be taken if you have a supplier that doesn't meet the level. Make sure to include the possibility that you're going to remove them from your approved supplier list. There are 3 common compliance issues when it comes to supplier nonconformance. They may non-comply with the quality agreement, they may non-comply with their delivery practice, and they may non-comply with how they ship product. When it comes to determining a non-compliant practice with the quality agreement, you want to find out whether they did it on purpose or by mistake. If they did it on purpose, ask them again to confirm, and ask them if they think it's going to happen again. If they did it by mistake, ask them what caused it. They don't need to do any sort of official root cause analysis. Just ask them what they think might have caused that, and ask them if they think they're going to take any corrective action to stop it from happening again. Everything in writing. Email counts as writing. And when you perform your supplier assessment, 80% or 90%, make sure you take this type of noncompliance into account. When it comes to noncompliant deliveries, it's really between purchasing and the supplier, with the exception of damage. If a product is received damaged, that's a little more than just purchasing issues, that it came there 3 days instead of overnight, something to that effect. And again, you'll see this several times throughout. Make sure you factor this into your supplier rating, in your supplier assessment. The non-compliant shipment to specification, meaning the component doesn't meet spec, is the most common of these 3. This can be reported not just from when you incoming inspect something, because most of the time your incoming inspection is a sample inspection. So you could determine that a component you received is bad during your in-process test, or in-process inspection, or during assembly, perhaps even it doesn't fit, for example. Or a field report, as I mentioned earlier, you receive a complaint, you do an analysis to show that a particular component was bad. That's a non-compliant shipment to specification. In any of these situations, make sure that you document the nonconformance either on your complaint report, your incoming in-process test or inspection report, or during your assembly nonconforming report, and include as much detail as possible. However, make sure you limit this detail to exactly what is wrong with the component. It doesn't matter how you're going to disposition the component. It doesn't matter what somebody thinks caused the nonconformance. A lot of detail, but limited detail also. You want to make sure when you have a component or components that don't meet spec, you have to figure out what you're going to do. I like to look at it 2 ways. If this is a single occurrence or it's an isolated occurrence, I'm going to email this, have usually materials or logistics, send an email to the supplier letting them know that we had a nonconformance. I want them to know about it. They might want me to return product. If I do, I want to make sure they're paying for that. Sort of like the first one is free. But if it's happened multiple times, if this is a second or greater occurrence, especially in a limited period of time, I want to issue them a supplier corrective action request, which is a SCAR. This is the first page of the SCAR. And obviously, I'm going to give the SCAR a number and a date. My due date is usually about 30 days after the SCAR has been issued. And the specifics are throughout the rest of the SCAR. As you can see, I want to make sure to tie it to a complaint or non-conforming material report or a defective material transfer report. I want to tie it to a specific document on which it was discovered. I want to also link it to a purchase order if I can. And very importantly is the description of nonconformance. What is wrong with this particular component? And then I have my disposition right here. Many times when you issue a supplier a SCAR, Supply Corrective Action Request, they request you return some nonconforming products to them. So just be prepared for that. They're going to complete Section 2, and they're going to tell you the root cause of the nonconformance and what corrective action was, has been, or will be taken, which is why under corrective action taken to prevent recurrence, we have a date of implementation field and then actual and projected. So you can figure out when they did it. They sign it, then Section 3 is it comes back to your firm and you have the originator. In many cases that might be purchasing. And then you have quality sign it also so as to accept their response. As I mentioned earlier, you do want to try to return the nonconforming item with the SCAR. It helps the supplier out. When the SCAR is returned, look at the investigation. Make sure that your originator and quality look at it to make sure the investigation is in-depth enough. And did they do anything other than looking at the returned item? We do see that from time to time. Just want to give you a heads up on that. And when it comes to corrective action, ask yourself whether the corrective action was what I call global enough. Was it truly corrective enough, or was it merely just a correction to the part? Keep track of your outstanding SCARs, like a SCAR log or something like that. And if you don't get anything back from the supplier, you want to reissue the SCAR at a fixed interval. I like to encourage my people maybe a week after the initial due date, issue it again, and quite honestly, issue it every week after that. If you don't get a contact, you yourself, the originator himself, should either contact the head of quality at that company or contact your own head of quality to try to contact their counterpart at your supplier. What do you do if after the SCAR, the supplier has another nonconformance? Do you issue them another SCAR? And the question is, the answer is, if it's for a different nonconformance, then yes, you issue them a new supplier corrective action request. But what that means is that you haven't seen it before, so give them the opportunity to correct it. But if it's for the same nonconformance, you're going to be calling them. This is the first time in the supplier management process where I recommend you give serious consideration to an on-site audit, because what the supplier has shown you here is that they can't fix what they say they're going to fix. And again, make sure this is factored into your supplier assessment. Just a word about eliminating approved suppliers. It's not just purchasing and quality determination. You want to consider a couple of factors. One is this the only supplier of the particular item? Or, equally important, is this the only cost-effective supplier? So you want to look at those two questions. Also, how long will it take for you to identify a replacement supplier? You can't just remove an approved supplier off of a list until you have somebody else to get that component from. How is it going to impact your customers? Will there be any back order as a result of this? Just make sure that you keep everybody at the company informed, sales and marketing, people like that. And you may, it's up to you, if you don't document control your approved supplier list, so any sort of ECO or DCO, what have you, may not be necessary. Merely a memo to the regulatory or materials files that explain why a particular supplier was removed from the list should be sufficient. So in summary, all nonconformances are factored into the supplier assessment. When it comes to quality agreement noncompliances, why? Delivery, usually you don't need to do anything unless damage occurred. When it comes to spec noncompliances, you don't really need to do anything from an investigation and corrective action perspective until you have multiple occurrences. Try to work with your suppliers because you depend on them as equally as they depend on you. Just remember also that some suppliers can't be worked with. Section 6 is, as opposed to me reading it, because we're sort of going past the hour a little, is a list of all of the required documentation for a supplier management program by each area, beginning with supplier qualification. Those are the documents you need. Where it says QA agreement, that should say quality agreement. I apologize for that. Supplier selection, there's the list of documents you're going to need for that. For your supplier monitoring, here are the documents you're going to need for that. And how long you maintain the documents for each of these items is finished device specific. So just remember that. It's not system specific, it's device specific. So to summarize, when you qualify your supplier, make sure you do so under clearly defined criteria. When you select your supplier, make sure you have a good list or a good record of suppliers that you've selected, but also suppliers that you've not selected to be able to show that your process has gone both ways, acceptable and unacceptable. When you do your supplier assessment, you don't have to go to you don't need to go visit your suppliers unless you want to. And make sure also that if you don't go, your documentation has to provide a very, very complete picture of the product and the assessment process that you used to assess your supplier. This supply management system is a compliant one, and it's a cost-efficient one because FDA regulations and ISO standards do not require an on-site visit. Well, thank you very much. That's the end of the webinar. Again, I apologize for the coughing, and we can take Q&A right now.
Right. Thank you so much, Jeff. I hope you do feel better. Ladies and gentlemen, like Jeff just said, we shall go ahead and start the Q&A session. So if you do have any questions, this would be your time. So please do go ahead. What you could do is to post your questions, you could go ahead and click on the raise hand option, which is a palm-like icon on your participants panel. So wherein you could post your questions verbally, or you could go ahead and post your questions in the Q&A panel so that our presenter can read it out loud and answer the questions. Or in case you're not able to do either of the two, you could always send me your questions via the chat messenger, and I will have it forwarded to Jeff to get you an answer. So if you do have any questions, ladies and gentlemen, please do go ahead. And at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, I also want to keep you all informed that the feedback form will appear on your screen in the polling panel right now. The feedback form has over 8 questions there, and all are in multiple choice, and it shouldn't take you more than 2 minutes of time to answer these questions. And we would be grateful if you could go ahead and fill out the feedback form, because that would let us know how the webinar went and if there are any positives and negatives that we can take forward. So would really appreciate that as well. And at the same time, if you have any questions, yes. Jeff, I do have a question for you here. So I'll just go ahead and unmute the line of the speaker.
Okay, sounds good.
Linda, please go ahead.
Oh, so talking about the supplier survey that you would send to the supplier, are there any issues with, I mean, since it's a self-assessment, are there any problems with them, you know, maybe responding in a more positive way than is real? I mean, you know, because if I use the term process, I usually, as a quality person, I assume that means a written procedure, whereas other people who are like not ISO or GMP might use that term differently.
That's a great question. What I recommend you do then is sort of send them a cover letter or contact them and explain that, or modify your supplier or your supplier survey to put the word documented before system everywhere it appears. But even with that, I've seen times where people not so much lie, but maybe sort of exaggerate a little, and what ends up happening is it all comes out in the wash. Any more lies or exaggerations are borne out by the quality product that we thought we would receive, but we don't.
Yeah. Also, for the SCAR, would you do something similar for like a service issue?
Yeah, you would issue same type of supplier corrective action on a service issue as well. Yes.
Okay. Thanks. That's all.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, I have another question in the Q&A panel. I'll just read that out to you. The question says, any aspects of these recommendations not apply to raw material supply for biologics or drug manufacturer?
No, they all apply. All the regulations are still applicable and useful as well.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. And I hope that suffices the answer. If you do have any questions, please do go ahead. We can take in a few more questions here. So if you do have any questions, please do go ahead. And also, ladies and gentlemen, while I do wait for the questions to come up, I also want to just keep you aware that today's webinar is available in a recorded format. So if you are interested in today's topic or a few other topics you do see on the screen, you could always give us a call or log on to our website for the purchase of any recorded webinars pertaining to Mr. Kassoff. And also in your handouts, you do see the link provided as well on the page. So you could just click on the link and it will direct you to the page of Mr. Jeff Kassoff on the Global Compliance portal. So if you are interested in any of them as well, you could always give us a call. And Jeff, I don't see any questions coming up here, so we should go ahead and conclude the session here for today.
Okay.
Any final concluding remarks before I let you go?
No, I just want to appreciate everyone's patience again, and just pay close attention to maintaining supply efficiency and cost reduction in your supplier management program. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, for any suggestions, you could always give us a call, or you can see the numbers on screen, or for any suggestions as well, please do write in. The email addresses are as well on the screen. I do appreciate all of you logging in, and for Jeff taking time from his work to log in today as well. So I really appreciate all of you logging in. Just want to wish you all a happy holiday and also a Merry Christmas as well. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Jeff, thank you so much. I'm so sorry you weren't keeping too well today.
That's okay. That's why webinars are great.
What I'll do, Jeff, is probably in the next 15 minutes time, I'll go ahead and send you the feedback information.
Okay, sounds good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff. You take care of yourself.
Okay, bye now.